Hi, thank you for your talks. I have two questions. The first is for Sally. For your snow classification scheme, I was wondering if it's just based on spectral bands or if you used ancillary data as well.
So we're really just starting along this line, and we've used spectral data because that's what we mostly had available our first go-round. Well, and we did use TerraSRX. TerraSRX didn't help really at all. Spectral bands a little bit, but we're going to be looking at different sensor systems, especially when we get the full suite from the SNOWX, and probably aimed more towards radar signals.
And my second question is for Rob, on the less glamorous side of things. When you do drop the sticks and leave them in the water, is that part of your upfront strategy plan, and what kind of backlash do you get with permitting?
You mean in terms of losing the trackers or losing the UAVs?
The UAVs.
We don't really know how to tackle the permitting at the moment. We've visited it, but it's kind of the whole problem with the UAVs is it's a gray area. It was very challenging even to be able to fly them in low visibility conditions. Just to be able to say, look, we're not operating over built-up areas, and we're not operating with other vessels. We're not operating. The only thing that's in the vicinity is the icebergs. So we've really the permitting is we we're struggling to kind of tackle that in a proper way because there isn't the infrastructure for it. There isn't the paperwork for it. I mean, we have the permission to fly them, and the Canadian rules have just gone through a big change July the 1st of this year, where they've downgraded the SOFCs, the flying certification. And so it's become a lot easier and a lot more complicated. So just for general people to fly UAVs, it's become a little bit easier. There's a caution go on, but it's also become more restrictive in that they've very clearly delineated where you can and cannot fly. So that actually made it easier for us to fly, but in terms of, because prior to that we had to get special operating certification for just dropping something, just putting something on the iceberg was a grey area. But that's changed. And because we're not operating near airports or anything like that, that's also kind of, it got easier in July. It certainly got a bit easier. But I don't think I'm answering your questions about we're losing vehicles.
So it's kind of ad hoc once you were on the ship and it happened?
Yes, I mean, we don't intend to, but we have done. And in the 2018 program, when we lost our first one, we couldn't put any more tags out. It was one of those learning moments. Oh, we didn't bring another one. We didn't think it would happen. Like, why would that happen? Like, we're not that stupid, but it turned out we were that stupid. And we lost one, and then we still did a lot of the ice-penetrating radar work, but we lost the delivery drone. And so it was like, well, okay, never again. We'll go cheaper, and we'll have 10 of them in the hold, which has worked. It's worked for collecting data.
Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question for Bob. Have you looked into doing any of your drone work using autonomous planning and dropping hardware and so on?
So we're trying to work out what to do next, like what direction do we want to go next. Just the learning curve, and I think Philip and Brian will say, the difficulty of just operating the UAV from a vessel was a huge learning curve. Like when you use the commercial flight control software, they don't want to, if the vessel is moving, they struggle to initialize. There's all sorts of problems. So you have to downgrade all of these safety critical systems just so you can take off in some cases and get off out over to the iceberg. The ship's moving often, in 3-meter seas, we're not using vessels with station holding capabilities. So it's getting knocked around. So there's no way to come home. There's no home to come to unless we were to build a homing device that the UAV can come back to. But because we're not trying to do beyond line of sight operations, we don't want to go down that road yet. And in terms of, we've talked about could we tag the iceberg or laser point the iceberg to say, hey, listen, drone, we want you to go towards that. And then we're going up the scale of, we're making the drone more complex that we're probably going to lose anyway because we're going to crash it into an iceberg. And I can show many, many tens of videos where we're nearly clipping a pinnacle. Like the icebergs don't offer themselves a nice target. There's nice tabular icebergs. You get a tabular iceberg, it's easy. You fly to it, and you could probably quite happily develop an optical floor system that would allow you to target it, drop it, and come back. But 90% of the time, the iceberg is a very unpleasant thing that you really don't want to be anywhere near. And so, to answer the question, we think about it. We don't know whether we want to go down that road yet.
So Sally, just a question. Your offices in Alaska, are they at Fort Wainwright and Jaber, Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson?
Yes, I think right now we have about 12 people at Wainwright, and we have pretty nice laboratory facilities for environmental assessment down at Anchorage, but that's not occupied at the moment.
Okay. And do you guys do any publishing on like best practices for remote sensing in polar environments kind of stuff?
Well, that would be a great one, actually. I guess it depends on what you're remote sensing for, however. So we've done best practices for more operational kind of things like lubricants and fuels in the cold and batteries in the cold and stuff like that. So expanding that to best practices for some of the remote sensing stuff would be a great idea.
And then just a question as to Bob, as far as the icebergs. Have you guys, are you just in the UAV, or are you looking at just the best way to identify icebergs? And if it's the later, have you guys looked at machine learning or anything to be able to better detect and the less detectable icebergs via satellite?
Yes, that is. So the UAV is a means to the end, by all means. You know, the objective is surveying and monitoring icebergs. Whatever tools we can bring to bear on that problem, we're interested in. So a big chunk of that, the 2019 campaign, was to improve to get ground truth data to improve machine learning algorithms, because there's various entities interested in developing those techniques. We ourselves have done some work in that, and other entities are interested as well. So, yes, the answer is yes. Down the road, that's what we want to get to. That we don't need to be going out throwing tags onto icebergs. We can be at home having a cup of tea.
In the Antarctic at McMurdo, we have a ice road that's over 10 miles long, and it goes from sea ice to shelf ice. Early in the season, we're cold, then we warm up, and then we get cold again towards the end of the season, and maintaining that road is a challenge. So is there a way to, or a solution for monitoring deterioration of the road so that we can schedule maintenance?
The question was on monitoring the deterioration of the roads. Is that what you said?
Right. As the season progresses, soft spots develop, and getting ahead of that, detecting where those soft spots are or what the impact of a specific vehicle is at a particular point. Is there a solution for actively monitoring the deterioration of the road so we can get crews out before it becomes a problem?
Yeah, I think there definitely is, actually. We did some work on the snow roads years ago, maybe about 10 years ago or 8 years ago. And one of the things you can do, and a lot of people talked about this today, is we have all this tracking technology that easily gives us geospatial data, and that together with what the vehicle's actually doing can give you early indications of where the vehicles are having trouble on the roads just from the vehicle data. And then also with the remote sensing monitoring tells you pretty clearly where the snow is wet. So you could track that as well.
So I didn't quite get this. So standoff distance, what is that?
Do you mean for the...
That was for Sally. She showed a slide of
Standoff distance of...
I don't know. You had a slide that was about standoff distance. I didn't understand what that was.
Standoff sensors?
Okay.
Did it say distance?
I don't know.
Probably an
But what is that?
So we use, a lot of people use the terms remote sensing and kind of standoff sensing interchangeably. We're kind of more looking at remote sensing for like the aerial or satellite versus standoff sensing, which could be just from a vehicle or maybe a drone.
Okay.
So that's maybe where I was going with that. Sorry if that was
That was the part that I got confused about. And Robert, I will say that there is a company that was from Finland, but it's now in San Francisco, called Gaze Incorporated, and they make solid state lidars that will go in the blue, so you can see through fog at a considerable distance, which would help with your, navigating your line of sight operations for the unmanned aircraft.
I think John will have to probably give some better information behind, but we did purchase a LiDAR that did promise some pretty impressive results, even in low visibility conditions. And am I correct in saying it didn't quite live up to its promise, John?
I don't know if that's completely fair to say. I mean, they told us that if we could see it visually, then they should be able to scan it. So it did a reasonable job at that, but we're always looking to improve it.
The reason I mentioned Gaze is I think they are one of the only companies that does have solid state blue and ultraviolet, which they did specifically so you could see through rain and fog. So, and they're small, sort of like this big.
And then this one's for Robert. And I think I was mentioning it to John yesterday too at the poster session. And I was just wondering if you've had any interest from either glaciologists or people working at the interface between glaciers and the ocean to kind of get at the data that you guys are generating. I could see how that would also be across interests.
We're terrible at self-promotion. We sit in St. John's and we do our job, and we don't talk about it very much. We're not great at publishing just because it falls by the wayside, because we're a not-for-profit, but we have to pay the bills. And it's one of the frustrations I think we have is we often think, well, we really should reach out more, and this is why this is the kind of conference that we want to say we really should be talking to more people and saying this is what we're doing, and we don't know if anyone's interested in talking to us a bit more. So the answer is no, we haven't. We really should, because I think we do some. Well, just coming to this conference, I think we still do. We are doing things that are legitimately valuable to other people, and it's nice to see that people are kind of crossing. Philip talked about some of the people who are doing similar work, but the answer is no, sadly.
No, I just remember, I forget where it was, but I think it was a topic of interest, like trying to track icebergs or come up with models that will, and then that relating to them melting once they kind of reach the more open ocean. And it just seems like you guys are doing something that I haven't seen yet, so.
There have been a couple of cruises tracking icebergs in the Antarctic, and of course, those are pretty big icebergs in many cases. And because they're cruises, they've only been able to track and monitor them for about 3 weeks. And yet, we know that those big icebergs drifting around have a fairly major effect on the ecosystem. If you look over time, the number of blue whales just shows up and shows up and shows up and shows up. And so one of the challenges that we have posed for the new Norwegian research vessel REV for their first Antarctic cruise in 2023 is to design and implement autonomous systems to stay with the iceberg as it drifts over the course of a full year, both unmanned aircraft and surface vessels and AUVs. So this is sort of what she was getting at in terms of there are some other ecosystem questions about these. And one of the interesting studies on the tabular icebergs in Antarctica, which I found sort of interesting and slightly surprising, is that, I'll have to put the mic down a second. It actually sort of, instead of being flat, as it evolves over time, there is a gouge that comes up. So there's a lip on the front of the iceberg. And then there's a gouge. And the fact that that melting happens in that pattern, it's slightly related to length, but it seems to form regardless of what length they are. And that affects the interaction with mixing in the water column as it drifts. And it sort of can form a cat's eye circulation underneath there. So there are some really interesting things that I think some of the technologies you've had, we are looking at trying to figure out how to do this on the bergs in Antarctica, because those bergs are having an effect on carbon absorption in the Southern Ocean, and we don't have a good handle on that. And we are getting more icebergs in the Southern Ocean, just like you are in the Arctic Ocean. So this is one of the questions, is how does that affect the ecosystem, both for carbon and the higher trophic levels as well? So I think some of that would be very useful to some of the people who are interested in this. And so far as I know, there have only been 2 real cruises that have tracked icebergs. There may be another one planned, I forget right now. It's an interesting topic.
So thanks so much for everybody's great questions and discussion. If you'll join me in thanking our great speakers as well.